13 Chicago Pile. Early on the morning of December 2nd, 1942, two figures crunched over the frozen snow covering the campus of the University of Chicago. It was terribly cold, below zero, remembered Leona Woods, a 23-year-old physics grad student. Walking alongside Woods, hunched against the cold, was the world-famous Italian physicist Enrico Fermi. Woods and Fermi ducked through a gate leading into the football stadium. They nodded to security guards and hurried down a dark hallway beneath the stands, their breath forming frost clouds in the air. It was just as cold inside as out. Under the football stands were a series of unheated squash courts. They opened the door to one of the courts and stepped inside. The scene of this test at the University of Chicago would have been confusing to an outsider, Fermi later said. He would have seen only what appeared to be a crude pile of black bricks. Shaped like an oval, the black pile was about 25 feet wide in the middle and 20 feet high. Woods and Fermi climbed up to a balcony high above the court. The balcony was originally meant for people to watch squash players, said Woods, but now it was filled with control equipment and readout circuits glowing and winking. A young physicist named Herb Anderson walked in, yawning, and helped do a few last-minute checks. Everything was set for one of the most important experiments in the history of science. But first, breakfast. Herb, Fermi, and I went over to the apartment and I shared with my sister, Woods said. I made pancakes, mixing the batter so fast that there were bubbles of dry flour in it. When fried, these were somewhat crunchy between the teeth, and Herb thought I had put nuts in the batter. After a quick meal, the three set out across campus to the football stadium. Back we mushed, said Woods, through the cold, creaking snow. Oppenheimer was busy recruiting scientists for Los Alamos, but that didn't mean he knew for sure an atomic bomb was technically possible. He and other physicists had spent a few years studying fission. They knew that they could bombard a uranium atom with neutrons and cause its nucleus to split. They knew the splitting nucleus would release energy. But what happened next? Theoretically, as the uranium nucleus split in two, more neutrons would break free and fly off on their own. The speeding neutrons would collide with other uranium atoms, causing them to fission also. As these uranium atoms split, they would release more neutrons, which would hit more uranium atoms. These atoms would also split, releasing still more neutrons, which would hit more uranium atoms, causing more fission. More free-flying neutrons, more fission, more neutrons, and so on. Though they didn't know if it would actually happen, physicists had a name ready for this process: chain reaction. Each splitting atom would release a small amount of energy, so scientists knew that if they could cause a fast enough chain reaction, they might be able to build atomic bombs. But first, they had to prove a chain reaction was even possible. That's what Enrico Fermi and his team were trying to do in the squash court under the football stands in Chicago. The black blocks were graphite, the mineral used to make pencil leads. Slid into holes in some of the blocks were small pieces of uranium. Fermi used graphite to slow down the speeding neutrons. He knew that neutrons would bounce off the carbon atoms that make up graphite and lose speed. Traveling a bit more slowly, they'd be more likely to hit the uranium atoms and cause fission. Stuck through the pile at various points were long wooden poles wrapped in a bluish-white metal called cadmium. Cadmium was chosen for its ability to absorb huge numbers of neutrons. As long as the cadmium poles were in place, they would absorb the neutrons shooting out of the uranium. This, Fermi told Leslie Groves, would prevent a chain reaction from starting. Still, the idea of attempting to release nuclear energy in the middle of a city of 3 million made Groves very nervous. If the pile should explode, no one knew just how far the danger would extend. Groves fretted. Because of this, I had serious misgivings about the wisdom of doing the experiment there. Fermi assured Groves he knew exactly what he was doing. A little before 10 a.m., Fermi and his team of about 15 students and scientists assembled in the freezing squash court. Most climbed to the balcony, but 3 stood on an elevated platform near the ceiling, holding buckets full of cadmium. If the reaction got out of control, they were to dump the cadmium on the pile, then get out fast. Fermi sat in a chair on the balcony. He looked over his blinking monitors, then ordered the first cadmium rod to be lifted out of the pile. As the rod went up, specially built machines measured the flying neutrons, clicking loudly as more neutrons were released inside the pile. Fermi did some quick calculations in his notebook. Then he ordered another rod up. The clicking sounds increased again. Fermi did a new set of calculations and called for another rod to be lifted. As the experiment continued, more and more curious scientists crammed into the balcony. Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner, the ones who'd triggered the Manhattan Project by convincing Albert Einstein to warn President Roosevelt of the danger of atomic bombs, came to watch. Everyone was shivering and covered with black graphite dust. No one spoke but Fermi. Only one cadmium rod remained in the pile. Fermi's team called it the zip rod. A physicist named George Whale stood on the floor, holding the rope that lifted it. Fermi called, "Go ahead, George!" The rod went up a foot. The clicking increased. "Another foot, George!" Weil pulled the rod a bit higher. You could hear the sound of the neutron counter, clickety-clack, clickety-clack, and said Herb Anderson. Leona Woods kept her eyes on the monitors, calling out measurements to Fermi. "Another foot, George!" The rod went up again. The tension in the room rose with the clicking. Only Fermi seemed to be enjoying himself. "This'll do it," he announced, a confident grin spreading across his face. "Now the pile will chain react." Weil pulled the rod completely out of the pile. Then the clicks came more and more rapidly, said Anderson, and after a while they began to merge into a roar. Fermi's smile got bigger. "The pile has gone critical." The chain reaction was going and would continue doubling in power every 2 minutes until he shut it down. 2 minutes passed. Fermi watched the monitors but said nothing. Everyone began to wonder why he didn't shut the pile off, Anderson said. The machines continued to roar. Fermi calmly took a few notes. He waited another minute, then another, said Anderson. The anxiety was too much to bear. Finally, Fermi said, "Zip in!" The cadmium rod dropped back into the pile, followed by the other rods. The clicking machines went quiet. There was a long silence in the squash court. Then, unsure what else to do, everyone began to clap. The controlled release of atomic power has been demonstrated for the first time in history, Fermi said of his experiment. The pile had generated only enough energy to power a small light bulb. But the chain reaction had been proved. Humans now knew that they could release the enormous power locked inside atoms. For some time, we had known that we were about to unlock a giant, remembered Eugene Wigner. Still, we could not escape an eerie feeling when we knew we had actually done it. Wigner pulled out a bottle of red wine and a stack of paper cups. He filled the cups, and the scientists and students silently passed them around. No one offered a toast, Leona Woods recalled. There was a greater drama in the silence than if words had been spoken. Woods couldn't be sure what the others were thinking. She had a feeling their thoughts were similar to her own. Of course, the Germans have already made a chain reaction, she said to herself. We have, and they have been ahead until now. Then she thought, when do we get as scared as we ought to?